Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 12 wide receiver rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. And when we talk about the wide receiver position, it's essential to go back and look at just how important the 2019 season was. In a half PPR scoring format, 5 of the top 12 wide receivers had made the list for the first time in their career. I mean, just looking at the number 2 overall wide receiver, a guy like Chris Godwin last season, came out of absolutely nowhere. Yes, we had the hype of the preseason, but no one could have anticipated the lengths and the depth of how great his performance would have been last season, even including the fact that he didn't play the entirety of the season due to an injury. So when we look at the 2020 rankings, sure, I have 12 studs on screen, but there are definitely a group of hundreds of wide receivers out there potentially that can make the top 12 list this coming season, because the volatility at the wide receiver position and the injuries that are unanticipated for can definitely play a role and can definitely make one of these underlying maybe sleepers into a potential top 12 stud for your lineup. But regardless, let's go ahead and let's move into today's topic, the top 12 wide receiver rankings. Before we begin, again, timestamps are down in the description of the video for those of you who are looking for a specific player's information. Outside of that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more 2020 fantasy football content and like today's video. I really do appreciate when you guys do that. It does help me out a lot. Regardless, so let's go ahead and move on and let's start talking about my number 1 wide receiver for the 2020 season. It's Michael Thomas, far and away. Michael Thomas is probably everybody's number 1. I think this year more than perhaps ever, the number ones at every position is pretty unanimous, and that's mainly because of the performances they distributed and demonstrated last season. All in all, I think the way that this works in terms of Michael Thomas, I just got to read his stats. The fact that he was able to produce over 300 points in a flex ranking, he was only behind Christian McCaffrey. This guy had 185 targets for 149 receptions. Again, 149 receptions is the league record for a single season wide receiver. Now, he surpassed Marvin Harrison's 143 catches in a season, which is absolutely legendary. He had produced 1,725 receiving yards. That's Michael Thomas last season, with 9 receiving touchdowns, 301 fantasy points, like I mentioned, and an 18.75 fantasy point per game average. To be honest, again, a legendary performance to say the least, but it's not like we couldn't see this coming. Michael Thomas has been an extremely valuable fantasy prospect and talent for the New Orleans Saints since the beginning of his career with them. I mean, coming out of college, this guy started his first 3 seasons in the NFL with a total of 321 catches, which is a record in itself. Going into his 4th season, honestly, all they did was buy in more to the fact that Michael Thomas can separate himself from defenders and make plays on a consistent basis. And when we think about the fact that he surpassed this record for receptions in a season, it's kind of surprising to kind of think, okay, you know what? He did that. Drew Brees is his quarterback. But yeah, Drew Brees missed 6 games last season, guys. I mean, to be honest, the fact that 6 games, I mean, more than a quarter of his season was contributed from the targets that he got from Teddy Bridgewater, just makes you think just how good Michael Thomas really is in terms of overall talent, besides the fact that he is a fantasy producer at the current level that he's at. I mean, the current level that he's at, he's getting drafted in the 1st round. He's practically the Antonio Brown of the wide receiver position. When we go back and we look at Antonio Brown 2014, 2015, when he was producing 300 plus fantasy points a year and a half point PPR scoring format, that's exactly where Michael Thomas has gotten himself, and that's why he has all this hype going into the offseason and into the regular season as for sure the number 1 wide receiver and a guy that needs to be taken in the 1st round and not taken lightly. Again, this is a guy that over the last couple of years has continued to improve, starting his rookie season with a 76% catch rate. His sophomore season, 70% catch rate. In 2018, had an 85% catch rate. And then this past season, obviously with the increase in total targets, it dipped a little bit to 80.05. But an 80% catch rate for Michael Thomas means that anytime the ball is coming in his direction, most likely he's going to catch this ball and he's going to make a play. And that's why he was just a monster last year. Now, when we talk about the games that Michael Thomas was able to produce when he was targeted heavily, this is where he really separates himself, and this is why he was so successful last year. When Michael Thomas was targeted 10 plus times last season, he averaged 21.56 fantasy points per game. Now, in 2 of the games with Drew Brees, he didn't surpass it. And in 2 of the games with Teddy Bridgewater, he didn't surpass the 10 target mark. But when we think about just how ridiculously good he is when you feed him the ball, it's going to happen. They know that there's success in throwing him the ball and targeting him 10 plus times. To be honest, 10 plus targets when you throw the ball 30 times isn't a tough thing to ask, especially when Michael Thomas is as talented as he is. So going into 2020, we expect to see a lot of that. On top of it, besides the fact that he had 12 games of 10 plus targets, he had 10 games of 100 total receiving yards. That's ridiculous. He had 9 games of 10 plus receptions. And let's not forget to mention the fact that he plays in the NFC South. The NFC South has always been shootouts, and the wide receivers there have definitely prospered because of that over the years, whether it's Michael Thomas, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Julio Jones, and then honestly, in the last place team, DJ Moore is still produced at a very high level despite the quarterback play that he's faced over the last couple seasons, just based on the fact that he plays in the NFC South. I mean, Michael Thomas last season, if we don't count week 17, because he had already surpassed the record, they had already clinched a playoff spot, and they weren't going to need Michael Thomas to win that game. If we count the 5 games that he played full force and didn't have a cut in percentage of snaps played, he averaged 21.54 fantasy points against the NFC South secondaries. I mean, Michael Thomas is ridiculous. That means that, 6 times a season, he's going to be playing against very easy matchups that he does every year and dominates. This is a wide receiver that, in my opinion, is the most talented in the league right now. According to PFF, he wasn't the top graded wide receiver, only behind Chris Godwin and Julio Jones last year. But that's because of how much opportunity Michael Thomas got and how many more games he had to play. There's more, room for error potentially. And when we look at the quality of targets he had last year, sure, he had 185 targets. But according to PFF as well, only 155 of those were catchable balls. So when we look at the fact that 149 receptions on 155 catchable passes, it only continues to elevate the level of what kind of a receiver Michael Thomas is. All in all, this is a receiver that's done it over the years, consistently has balled out. I mean, has never ranked below the wide receiver overall 7 in his career, whether it's his rookie, sophomore, or junior season in the National Football League. He's always been a top 12 guy and always been above the top 7. And that's why he's my number 1. Consistency's there. Production levels there, opportunities there, and it's going to continue. Moving on. My number 2 wide receiver on today's list is Davante Adams. Now, Davante Adams dealt with a bit of an injury bug last year with the turf toe, impacting him in week 4. And he was having a really good game against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 4. Had over 100 receiving yards, was dominating that Eagles secondary, as a lot of teams typically do. Got the turf toe injury, missed 4 weeks, only played 12 games this past season, but in those 12 games had 127 targets, 10 targets per game on average, pretty good. 83 receptions, 997 receiving yards, only 5 receiving touchdowns, and I'll tell you why that's an only. 171.2 fantasy points, which is a 14.27 fantasy point per game average. Again, comparatively to a Michael Thomas, it's a 4-point decline, but there's a lot that we have to look at Davante Adams for, because the fact of the matter is Davante Adams wasn't healthy even when he came back, and the offense for the Green Bay Packers learned to survive without him. And it took him a couple weeks to kind of get himself re-ingrained within this offense and have Aaron Rodgers really target him and get him going. So when we think about what Davante Adams is capable of and what I'm about to tell you and what he's done in the past couple seasons, I can assure you Davante Adams is only going to improve from last season's performances. I mean, this is a guy that in 2016, 17, and 18 had 10 plus touchdowns every single year. So when I say only 5 receiving touchdowns, that's what I mean. This is a guy that every season has scored double-digit touchdowns, and that's what makes him fantasy relevant, besides the fact that he's the number 1 receiver of a Aaron Rodgers-led Packers offense. And what we've seen number 1 receivers from a Packers-led offense do in the last 10 years, I mean, Jordy Nelson made a career out of that. Even when Jordy Nelson was out, James Jones was a guy that was able to compete and be a great number 1. And Davante Adams has definitely taken up that mantle over the last couple years and ran away with it, certainly. Now, with Davante Adams last season, returned from injury, it was a little bit of an improvement, right? He averaged 15.11 fantasy points per game, so just slightly below a 1-point improvement when he returned in those 8 games. And in 7 of those 8 games, he had 10 plus targets. So he was starting to get on track and he was starting to produce. And not to mention the fact that in those late season games, in the last 6 games of the season, that's where all of his touchdowns came from. Prior to that, he didn't have any touchdowns. All those touchdowns came from literally the last quarter of the season, where he had finally gotten on track with Aaron Rodgers, and the chemistry had rebuilt itself, and they were starting to really cut Aaron Jones a little bit out of a couple touchdowns, even though he was running away with 19 of them. And even Jamal Williams was scoring 6 of them. Davante Adams had to get his because he always does. And that's always been a thing that Davante Adams has done in the red zone. And that's why I'm always confident in the fact that Davante Adams can consistently produce for this offense. I mean, when we look at what he was able to do in 2018, Davante Adams had the second most targets amongst all receiving options. I think it was 22 targets. It was 23 targets that led to 12 touchdowns. And then in the year prior, in 2017, he had 22 targets that led for 7 touchdowns in the red zone. This past season, only 18 targets to 4 touchdowns. Again, that number is going to increase this year. His opportunity is going to increase. And that only, in my opinion, breeds success for a fantasy option like this. Davante Adams is also a guy that you can honestly move around all over the field. Whether it's in the slot position where he can dominate against linebackers or, nickel corners. That's where he kind of finds his success in terms of touchdowns as well. I mean, he had 32 receptions for 270 receiving yards, and 4 of his touchdowns coming from the slot position because he thrives against those cornerbacks that really just can't cover him at times. That corner route that he has is absolutely nasty. And when we're talking about the division he plays in, the NFC North, he averaged 14.88 fantasy points per game against them this past season. He's a Packers wide receiver led by Aaron Rodgers. I think the fact that he's similar to a Michael Thomas, a DeAndre Hopkins, in the idea that they don't really have a second wide receiver. Sure, they brought in Devin Funchess this offseason, but I don't think Devin Funchess is going to be a defining factor for this offense and pull attention away from Davante Adams. He is a lone wolf, and he's going to produce similar to these other guys like Michael Thomas, DeAndre Hopkins, like I mentioned, and he's going to produce, certainly. But either way, his touchdown total is going to go up. His games played, targets are going to be there, receptions are going to be there, yards are going to be there. It's all a matter of just patience with him and just trusting in the Packers offense. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about my number 3. Another player that has been consistent over the last couple seasons. When I say last couple seasons, I mean the last 6 seasons of his career. Julio Jones has been a wide receiver 1, finishing as the number 3, 5, 6, 2, and 8 overall wide receivers in those seasons in a half PPR scoring format. Julio Jones, unfortunately, only played 15 games last season, had a little bit of an injury bug, but all in all, was an extremely consistent wide receiver with 157 targets, 99 receptions for 1,394 yards. His yardage total is always going to be a higher number, but has decreased over the last couple years, but we'll talk about the reason why. 6 total touchdowns, 224.6 fantasy points total, and then it was a 14.97 fantasy point per game average. Overall, when you're looking for consistency at the wide receiver position, Julio Jones is the number 1 name that comes up, especially for guys that you don't have to reach for in the first round. Davante Adams and Michael Thomas, I've seen go in the first round, certainly, but Julio Jones sometimes will sit at that edge 12th pick where somebody will pair him with a RB1 in order to find yourself a solid wide receiver that can produce just as good as any other running back in that area. And at the same time, he is going to produce because he's done it over the last 6 years, and you're not really worried about, potential. I mean, you obviously don't want to anticipate injuries occurring, but he really hasn't had a impacting injury since like 2013 that has knocked him out for a significant amount of time. But all in all, Julio Jones is a monster. I mean, the only problem I have with Julio Jones is that they don't target him enough. If Julio Jones saw targets like Michael Thomas, we would be talking about Julio Jones being the number 1 receiver coming off the board. I mean, last season when he was targeted 10 plus times, he averaged 18.78 fantasy points per game. And that was only in 7 games that he was targeted 10 plus times. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Calvin Ridley is a part of this offense, and Austin Hooper was out here stealing a lot of potential targets and receptions and being successful. It's not really a steal when, to be honest, he's succeeding with it. They got rid of Mohamed Sanu. So you think, okay, potentially there's some receptions available. But with Hayden Hurst there, Calvin Ridley coming back for, in my opinion, a season that a lot of people are going to remember. And then you still have Julio that's going to demand his 160 plus targets. I don't really see Julio being given the opportunity of a Michael Thomas and being hard force-fed, because to be honest, I don't think this offense is really set up for that. They need to spread the ball out, and that's what's kind of tough when we talk about Julio Jones' ceiling of potential. I mean, last season, he still had 6 games of over 100 receiving yards, had 3 games of 10 plus receptions. But again, in terms of opportunity, he's never going to be the guy that's, given the most targets in the year or catch the most passes, which is unfortunate, but it will hurt him in the long run in terms of fantasy football. Also, the issue that kind of has plagued Julio throughout his entire career is the fact that he doesn't really score many touchdowns. I mean, the last time he scored 10 plus touchdowns was 2012, which was his sophomore season. When we think about the amount of times he's targeted in the red zone, I mean, last season amongst all wide receivers, he had the 13th most targets with 16 targets for 5 receptions. I mean, we go back to a couple years, the guy was barely able to break, 8 targets in the red zone and get very much work there. It was kind of a slippery situation there because of, the offensive coordinator and everything that was kind of piling up for a team that was coming off of a Super Bowl hangover. But all in all, the way I see it, Julio Jones can be a number 1 wide receiver. He has the potential of it, and I expect him to produce in a way that could potentially get him on the right path. Now, Calvin Ridley, like I mentioned, is a problem. Is it going to hurt Julio? Abso-freaking-lutely. I mean, in the 3 games that Calvin Ridley missed at the end of last season, Julio Jones was targeted 48 times, had 30 receptions, 378 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns in 3 games. I mean, to be honest, 10 receptions per game, over 125 receiving yards per game, and almost a touchdown per game. He averaged 21.6 fantasy points in that time. All in all, sure, Julio Jones may not be given that many targets on a weekly basis, but I'm hoping the Atlanta Falcons want to approach that level and let one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, a future Hall of Famer, in my opinion, take over. But all in all, we'll see. I mean, Julio Jones, again, with his yard total, again, it has been decreasing over the last couple of years. I mean, we saw him a couple of years back with 1,800 receiving yards, where he had a monster season. I mean, he's still 4th in yards per route run. He's still good at the deep ball, 11 receptions of 20-plus yards. Had 105 total catchable passes. That's what led to his 99 receptions. All in all, Julio Jones, a stud, a consistent wide receiver in my number 3. Moving on, let's talk about my number 4, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill dealt with a little bit of injury. Again, that shoulder issue / I don't even know what you want to describe it as. Not a doctor. Regardless, he missed 4 games, and really it was kind of considered 5 games, considering the first game of the season against the Jacksonville Jaguars is when that injury took place, and unfortunately he had to leave that game. So all in all, I would say that we could just scale it out to potentially him playing 11 games. But in those 12 games, he did have 89 targets for 58 receptions, 860 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 159.3 fantasy points, 13.27 fantasy point per game average. But again, if we don't count week 1 and we don't count week 11, week 11 he had a hamstring injury when he played against the Los Angeles Chargers in Mexico City. If we don't count those 2 games, he still averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game. That's more than Julio. That's more than Davante Adams. That's only second to Michael Thomas last season in average. So when we think about what Tyreek Hill is capable of, I think number 4 is potentially doing Tyreek Hill wrong. I know what he's capable of. We've seen it. I mean, he was the number 1 overall wide receiver in half PPR in 2018. The year before that, he was the number 4 overall wide receiver. With Patrick Mahomes now having, $500 million coming down the pike for him, he's got his future set, and he's got to make sure that Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce are ready to catch bombs, because that's what they do best. And when we know that Tyreek Hill has been a guy that in 2018, 1,300 plus receiving yards, over 10 touchdowns, receptions, on a healthy pace, is going to be a monster and someone that on a weekly basis is going to have volatility. He's going to have that 1 week where he scores 30 points. Then he's going to have a week that he only scores 6 points. But that is the nature of the beast, and that's why I kind of have him at 4. I literally had this conversation with you guys last year, if you don't remember, talking about Tyreek Hill, that his volatility scares me at times. And it scares me to the point where he could lose me more potential games than win me during a season. Because, again, I need to have produced in the first 12 weeks of my fantasy season. And if in those 12 weeks, he only gives me 7 good performances and 5 poor performances as my number 1 wide receiver, I'm going to be honest, that's definitely going to hurt you. Sure, you can go 7-5 into the playoffs, but you're not going to be given a first round bye. You're going to be playing a tougher matchup, and it's going to hurt you. And that's what scares me with Tyreek Hill. It's not a matter of bye weeks or anything of that nature. It's a matter of volatility. But overall, the volatility stems from the fact that he is a deep ball receiver. And boy, does he do it well. And he probably does it better than anybody in the National Football League because of his deadly speed. I mean, honestly, he is a cheetah. Last season, he had 15 plus. What was that? What the heck is this? I don't even know what the stat is. I can't even read it. Regardless, last season had 19 targets of 20 plus yards or more. That led to 10 receptions for 383 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. So 4 of his 7 touchdowns came on deep ball passes. All in all, looks good to me. Moving on, when we talk about the quarterback play that's going to deliver him the rock, Patrick Mahomes, amongst all starting quarterbacks last season, was the 4th most accurate with 52.4% deep pass completion percentage. Looks good to me. On top of it, when we had a guy like Tyreek Hill injured, and then even then when he came back, we saw a lot of usage of Mecole Hardman and Demarcus Robinson. And I understand they're still on roster, but I feel like a lot of their opportunities are going to go back towards Tyreek Hill. Those 2 guys, Demarcus Robinson and Mecole Hardman, they had 7 total receiving touchdowns last season of 20 plus yards or more. What does that mean? The deep ball. So when we go ahead and think about what Tyreek Hill's potential is in 2020, I think I'm certain 1,000 plus yards is just a guarantee. And 10 plus touchdowns is only just around the corner. I'm just worried about his volatility. All in all, again, he is associated with the best quarterback in the National Football League right now, Super Bowl defending champions. I mean, what they did in the playoffs, we had the 3 types of weeks that Tyreek Hill typically does. The first game in the playoffs, didn't do much, maybe 6-7 fantasy points. Second week, had 2 receiving touchdowns, monster game. And then in the Super Bowl, had like 16 targets, over 100 receiving yards, and feasted on that 49ers tough secondary. Those are the different games that Tyreek Hill is going to give you. And that's what I expect. And even when he's healthy, when we're talking about receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, this is a guy that can get it down on the ground. I mean, we've seen him have 15, 20 plus rushing attempts in a season before. In his rookie year, had 267 rushing yards. And in 2018, had 151 rushing yards. Jet sweeps are always there. These kind of trick plays are always going to be an option for Andy Reid in this offense. I'm buying in on it. And I think he's going to be fantastic, to say the very least. So let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about my number 5, Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin had a lot of offseason hype. Bruce Arians was hired for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers job over Dirk Cutter. And the fact of the matter was that all the offseason hype was Chris Godwin is going to be my Larry Fitzgerald of this offense. And for those of you who don't know, Bruce Arians was the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals recently in 2016 when they really went far, 2015, 2016, when they went far in the playoffs, went to the NFC Championship game, but unfortunately lost to Cam Newton and the Carolina Panthers. But regardless, he said that he was going to make Chris Godwin his Larry Fitzgerald. And that's what he did. Even with the fact that Chris Godwin only played 14 games, he was a monster with 120 targets, 86 receptions for 1,333 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, 233.1 fantasy points, and a 16.65 fantasy point per game average. Overall, he was the number 2 wide receiver. I mentioned it earlier. This is a guy that came out of nowhere, someone that we expected to be good in 2019, but not this good. He started off so hot that in the first 5 games of the 2019 season, he scored 6 touchdowns. Is that ridiculous? Yes. And did that start off the legacy of the future of Chris Godwin? Abso-freaking-lutely. Especially considering the fact that now he's not going to be throwing the ball from Jameis Winston, who has the potential of being inaccurate, or turn over the ball and kind of kill drives. He has Tom Brady under center, and that's definitely going to help. And when we talk about Tom Brady, we have to mention the fact that Chris Godwin is a slot specialist. Chris Godwin played 63.4% of his offensive snaps from the slot position last year and gained 838 of his receiving yards and 5 of his touchdowns from the slot position. When we talk about Tom Brady and slot receivers, I mean, it's without a doubt a guy like Julian Edelman that's brought up. And we think to ourselves, Julian Edelman's, Wes Welker's, Danny Amendola's, they always thrive in offenses that Tom Brady is associated with. And I 100% can expect to see Chris Godwin have a successful year here in 2020. I mean, again, he went from the number 25 overall wide receiver in 2018 to the number 2 in 2019. And I have him at number 5 in 2020 because, yes, I expect him to improve, but I also expect the wide receivers around him to improve. I mean, when 233.1 points is the number 2 overall wide receiver, when we go back and we look at the last couple seasons in the National Football League, 233 points as your number 2 wide receiver is typically not going to be the case. We're going to see 270, 260, 250 point wide receivers, which is kind of going to lower a little bit of Godwin's potential. But again, he's going to play a 16-game season this year. He's going to be a monster. Overall, last season, he had only 3 games of 10-plus targets. That's going to increase. He had 100-plus receiving yards in 6 games. Hit 87 total catchable passes. Only dropped 1. That's why he led to 86 receptions. So those, 40-some-odd targets that he had going in his direction. 40-some-odd targets going in his direction just weren't accurate, plain and simple. But again, what did Tom Brady do with Julian Edelman last year, right? And how is that going to help the potential Chris Godwin? I mean, Julian Edelman saw 153 targets last season, was the slot specialist, and even dealt with a lot of injuries throughout the 2019 season. Still had 10 games of 10-plus targets. Still had 110 catchable passes. Overall, I'm going to see Chris Godwin take an extra step this year towards that greatness, and it's going to be at the hands of Tom Brady getting him there. Which is absolutely exciting to see. On top of it, another one of these NFC South wide receivers. He averaged 23.26 fantasy points per game in the 5 games he played against the NFC South. That is a ridiculous number, and I love to see it because he gets to play them 6 times this season. Overall, Chris Godwin's a ridiculously fantastic wide receiver. He was the number 1 overall graded wide receiver according to PFF last year, and he's top 4 in elusiveness. So even yards after the catch, when we're talking about a slot receiver being able to pretty much glide the middle of the field after all the defenders start to, compound on top of him. He was the 4th most elusive, only behind Deontay Johnson, A.J. Brown, Deebo Samuel, guys like that. But either way, Chris Godwin is the Larry Fitzgerald of this offense, and he's going to feast. He's my number 5. Moving on. Number 6, DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins takes a little bit of a dip. Not because of the fact that Kyler Murray is worse than a Deshaun Watson, but because DeAndre Hopkins is a very special wide receiver, and he needs a lot of opportunity to pretty much take that next step. I mean, we've seen him dominate with 170 targets, and we've seen him dominate with just a plethora of average quarterbacks. I mean, in his time in Houston, we saw DeAndre Hopkins play with 10 different quarterbacks, including guys like Deshaun Watson, Brock Osweiler, Brandon Weeden, Tom Savage, TJ Yates, Ryan Mallett, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Case Keenum. We saw him play with a bunch of bums, purely. But obviously with Deshaun Watson, it's been far more consistent over the last 2 years, but it's been a mutual existence, right? Because of the fact of how good DeAndre Hopkins has been, it does not diminish the fact that, Deshaun Watson is great, but they definitely do help each other. And he's going to help Kyler Murray, but how much can Kyler Murray potentially help him this coming season? Again, DeAndre Hopkins played 15 games last year. 150 targets, nearly 10. I mean, it really is 10 targets per game. 104 receptions, 1,165 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns for 217.54 total fantasy points. He had a passing touchdown in there as well. 14.5 fantasy points per game average. When we think about what DeAndre Hopkins is capable of doing, I mean, last season, 5 games of 100-plus receiving yards, has been a number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football for 4 out of the past 5 seasons. The only season where he didn't finish as a top 12 receiver was Brock Osweiler, unfortunately. But that was a 1-year fix. They got rid of him. But overall, I mean, he's been a consistent wide receiver. He's capable of these 100-yard games. He's capable of 10-plus receiving games, certainly, because he's done that throughout his entire career. It's just a matter of where does he fit in this new offense. And in my opinion, I think he's going to improve, but not in the way we potentially think. I mean, in comparison to the Houston way of, the Houston offensive way in their approach, they typically want to run 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets, or their second most popular was 12 personnel with 2 tight ends and 2 wide receivers. But every time DeAndre Hopkins was on the field with Houston, there wasn't really another offensive weapon downfield that helped pull away double coverage. Right? I mean, Will Fuller, his best season as the number 2 wide receiver was 680 yards. Outside of that, the year prior, nobody had surpassed over 550 receiving yards for the Houston Texans. I mean, we really had DeAndre Hopkins on an island. And like I mentioned, a lone wolf, similar to Michael Thomas and similar to Davante Adams. These guys have to, produce regardless of the coverage and regardless of what other players on the field are capable of. And they do it at a very high level. Now, when we walk into the Cardinals organization and we see that majority of the plays that they want to run come from 4 wide receiver sets, 3 wide receiver sets, it's going to potentially, in my opinion, open up some opportunity for DeAndre Hopkins to get one-on-one coverage, especially considering Christian Kirk, Andy Isabella, 2 of the speedsters on that team are going to be across the field from him. You'll have Larry Fitzgerald in the slot, and you could potentially open up the offense and feed him more passes and potentially even be a better wide receiver this year. But my only concern is the fact that Kyler Murray, deep ball passing, he was the 9th best amongst all starting quarterbacks going into 2020 last season. I mean, those numbers need to improve. If they don't, we're going to see some struggle from DeAndre Hopkins, because a lot of DeAndre Hopkins' production as well came from the slot position last season. Again, when you run these 3 wide receiver sets, you can put DeAndre Hopkins in the slot. But if Larry Fitzgerald, who had the most snaps amongst all wide receivers last year from the slot, is going to be taking that position, then, DeAndre Hopkins getting 43 receptions for 446 receiving yards and a touchdown last year from the slot isn't going to really translate this coming season. All in all, I think DeAndre Hopkins will be a good wide receiver. Certainly 1,200 yards, 7 touchdowns seems in line. I mean, to be honest, his total red zone opportunity in Houston hasn't been great. I mean, last year, Larry Fitzgerald had just as many targets and Christian Kirk had 1 less target in the red zone in comparison to DeAndre Hopkins. So all in all, really his opportunity there wasn't fantastic because they were running the ball and or they were finding Darren Fells in the red zone. But all in all, I think DeAndre Hopkins will be a good wide receiver. Just, I don't expect him to blow the doors off the roof of that stadium in Arizona. So overall, that's where I leave him at my number 6. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about my number 7, Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay, another one of these wide receivers that, again, wasn't anticipated to be a top 12 wide receiver, was certainly in that wide receiver 2 conversation 15-16 last year, but took great leaps and bounds in improvement. And he did that a lot with the fact that he didn't really have any quarterback help in the second half of the season. I mean, he still finished with 116 targets, 65 receptions, 1,190 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns for 215.5 fantasy points, which pretty much averaged out to 47 fantasy points per game in half PPR. In the first 8 games of the season with Matthew Stafford healthy, he averaged 15.19 fantasy points. So definitely a far better receiver with Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford returning to the Lions offense this season, that's definitely a plus. Now, obviously, there was a little bit of struggles with the fact that David Blau, Jeff Driscoll were the quarterbacks in the second half of the season, yet he still was able to produce, relatively well. Sure, Kenny Galladay's total, fantasy points per game dropped a pretty good margin in terms of the wide receiver position when the quarterback change occurred. But I still think that if you are capable enough to produce with those lower level quarterbacks, then, with Matthew Stafford returning healthy and ready to go, it's only going to improve Kenny Galladay's overall game. Now, my only concern with Kenny Golladay, and the reason why I'm a little afraid of putting him anywhere higher than number 7, is Marvin Jones. I talked about it in my draft kit last season. Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay are similar receivers. Big body, throw the ball up and let him go get it. And that's why he had 65 receptions for 1,190 yards. He is a down the field, go up and snag the ball in one-on-one, maybe double coverage at times because he's capable of doing it. And Marvin Jones is a similar type of wide receiver. Now, the issue is that Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay at times cannot produce at high levels in the same week. I mean, there were multiple weeks last season where Kenny Golladay struggled because everything was going in the direction of Marvin Jones. There was a game where, Kenny Golladay early in the season, 2.7 points because Marvin Jones had 19.1 on the other side of the field. Again, later in the season, 2.6 points, while Marvin Jones had a 4 receiving touchdown game with 38.3. Later in the season, again against Dallas, Kenny Golladay, 3.9 fantasy points, while a guy like Marvin Jones was scoring 17.9 fantasy points. So again, there's always going to be this struggle. There's always going to be the potential of Marvin Jones hurting him. But I'm hoping if Matthew Stafford is ready to go, we could potentially see Kenny Golladay even out and not have such volatile performances. But that's the wide receiver position as a whole. I understand it. But then you get Hawkinson coming back. You get another running back. You still have Amendola in this offense. I'm a little worried that there is potential target reduction for Kenny Golladay. And the fact of the matter is, when he's only getting 70 catchable passes and only 65 receptions, he's got to be able to produce in the red zone and have those deep ball plays in order to separate himself and make the top 12 list. But overall, last season, the opportunity was there at times. But when the opportunity really struck and 10 plus targets was on the table, Kenny Golladay averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game. Feed this man the ball, he'll get the job done. But there's going to be a lot of mouths to feed in Detroit this year. On top of it, had 5 games, 100 plus receiving yards, had 37 targets of plus 20 yards. Again, I told you he's a deep ball receiver that wants to play in one-on-one coverage. Of those 37 targets, he only had 16 receptions. But guess what? That led to 628 of his receiving yards and 5 of his 11 touchdowns. The rest of his 11 touchdowns, they came from the red zone, as he had 15 red zone targets leading to 6 touchdowns last year. All of those touchdowns coming from the 10-yard line and in. He's a big body wide receiver. They're going to throw it up to him on a fade. He's going to go get it, bring it down, and be a stud. And to be honest, it's not a rare thing to potentially see this offense throw the ball deep and then feed their big wide receivers. I mean, Matthew Stafford, even last year, in the short amount of time he played, 8 games, he was still, to be honest, I think he had 57 deep passing attempts. If he had played a 16-game season, he would have had the most deep pass attempts last season amongst all quarterbacks and probably would have made Kenny Golladay that much better of a receiver. So overall, we've seen the potential there in terms of deep ball receptions. We know the potential threat that Marvin Jones has in this offense, but if you're going to feed the ball to Kenny Golladay 10 targets a game, his opportunity is going to lead to success. We've seen this offense use 2 wide receivers and have 2 productive wide receivers. Back in 2017, Golden Tate, Marvin Jones, both of them surpassed 1,000 receiving yards. And just these past 2 seasons, 2018, 2019, Kenny Golladay surpassed 1,000 yards. So we've seen 1,000-yard receiver is a certainty. It's just a matter of how much more can he improve. Regardless, he's my number 7. I really like Kenny Golladay. Moving on to another receiver I really like, another Los Angeles Ram, Cooper Kupp. I talked about Tyler Higbee in a conversation about tight ends at my number 5, but I really do think that Cooper Kupp is the end-all be-all of this offense. He is the safety blanket for Jared Goff. Cooper Kupp, thankfully enough, was able to stay healthy last season and play 16 games, and it definitely helped the Rams offense as a whole. Cooper Kupp, 134 targets, 94 receptions, 1,161 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, double digit. That makes a big difference. 223.5 fantasy points, all for 13.97 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, when we think about what he was capable of doing in 2018 and that transitioning to 2019, a lot of us saw it coming. I've been talking about Cooper Kupp because I love him because he's a Los Angeles Ram, live in LA. But the fact that in 2018, from weeks 1 through 7, he was an animal. He was the number 2 wide receiver, averaging 18 fantasy points per game prior to his injury against Denver. Sure, he came back, had another 2 games, but then tore his ACL, which ended his 2018 season. When we think about the last 23 games that he started, he's averaged 14.67 fantasy points per game. Cooper Kupp is no joke. And in this offense, it's no surprise that we have another Los Angeles Ram make the top 12, because in 2018, Robert Woods was that wide receiver because of the fact that we saw Cooper Kupp have the injury and fall out. Now, going into 2020, where does Cooper Kupp stand? Again, he is the safety blanket for Jared Goff. He's a slot master, 69 receptions from the slot position, leading to 853 yards and 5 of his receiving touchdowns. to be honest, it's no surprise that a guy like Cooper Kupp is going to be able to dominate in the middle of the field, similar to Chris Godwin. When you put these players in the slot position and you just force defenses to stretch out with Robert Woods going downfield, Tyler Higbee going downfield. Yes, you had Brandon Cooks in the past, but you can definitely mitigate that with another wide receiver, potentially Josh Reynolds, running downfield. It's going to open up more and more offense and more checkdowns for Cooper Kupp, and that opportunity obviously has led to success. On top of it, he still gets red zone opportunity. Yes, he had the second most targets on his team. Tyler Higbee had the most red zone targets last year, but Cooper Kupp's red zone targets led to touchdowns. 18 total targets for 7 receiving touchdowns from the 20-yard line and in. That is a fantastic thing to see overall. Obviously, some of those coming from the slot position. On top of it, when we talk about the consistency of playing within the division, the NFC West, it's not an easy division, but he has still managed, especially last year, to average 14.07 fantasy points per game, which is better than his per game average. So that's always a promising thing, especially considering he had a couple games there where he struggled against this division, especially the 49ers. Overall, I'm excited about Cooper Kupp. I think he's certainly a top 12 wide receiver, and that's why he sits at my number 8. The consistency is there. The eye of the quarterback is there. Jared Goff is always going to feed him the rock, and with this offense losing a running back that over the past couple of years has been eating 20-plus touchdowns, 15-plus touchdowns, there's going to be a lot of opportunity, especially if you've got inexperienced running backs there and you need someone to close it out in the red zone. Cooper Kupp could potentially be that guy with Tyler Higbee. Last season, the Rams ran 73% of their offensive snaps out of 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets. To be honest, when you spread them out and you have Cooper Kupp over the middle, dicing up defenses, I only expect him to improve. Brandon Cooks disappearing. You're going to sit in a 3 wide receiver set. I think Goff will be looking in the direction of Cooper Kupp even that much more. So I expect good things coming from Cooper Kupp. And he'll prove that week 1. Week 1 against Dallas, he's going to carve that defense apart. He's my number 8. Moving on. Number 9, Mike Evans. Mike Evans played 13 games last year. End of the season, similar to Chris Godwin, they both had hamstring injuries, which pretty much killed their season at the end and killed their offense a little bit. But overall, he was fantastic to an extent. You guys don't even believe how many, it's unfathomable the amount of messages I got cursing out Mike Evans and me ever suggesting Mike Evans as a potential option last season. Now I get it. When we look at his end of season stats, it doesn't look like a problem, right? 118 targets, 67 receptions, 1,157 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, all for 119.2 fantasy points, 15.32 fantasy point per game average. That looks like good numbers, especially in 13 games. So when you think about it and you think, what do you mean frustration? A lot of you might not remember or may not have to deal with the unfortunate mess that Mike Evans was last year. But truth be told, at times, I thought Mike Evans may have owed Jameis Winston money because Jameis Winston at times did not want to even look in the direction of in the direction of Mike Evans. All in all, the way I saw it, it was really rough for a lot of us in the beginning of the season. And sure, Mike Evans has always been a consistent 1,000 receiving yard, wide receiver. He's done it every single season of his career. He's going to continue to do it with Tom Brady, but there was a little bit of a struggle last year. And I'm kind of glad that it existed because a lot of people are going to sleep on Mike Evans. And hopefully they let him slide on draft boards because Mike Evans is as talented as advertised. He's a big-bodied wide receiver that works down the field, similar to a Kenny Golladay that wants one-on-one coverage. And he feasts in those opportunities. But again, like I mentioned, there were a lot of times where Mike Evans and Jameis Winston were not connecting last year. Outside of the 3 big performances, and when I say big performances, I mean unbelievable games. Jameis Winston produced 3 games that pretty much defined his fantasy season. A 41-point game, a 37.3-point game, and a 30-point game. That totaled for 31 receptions, 568 of his yards, and 6 of his touchdowns in 3 games. Again, he scored 8 total touchdowns in 13 games, 6 of them coming from 3. In the rest of those games, he averaged only 9 fantasy points per game. That kind of a volatility is scary. But I don't expect Mike Evans to kind of fall back into that because I expect Tom Brady to be a better quarterback and facilitate his most valuable offensive pieces, unlike Jameis Winston was capable of doing last year. He still had 5 games of 10-plus targets last season. That is Mike Evans. And a lot of that was those games that he really feasted. When we looked at the average of him getting 10 plus targets last season. He averaged 26 fantasy points per game when he had 10 plus targets. Sure, that's pretty much blown out by the fact that those huge performances were 10 plus targets, but maybe there's a correlation there. Maybe we should look into that. Maybe we should pass the best receiver on the team the ball more often. Jameis potentially thought not. I mean, there were games last season where he finished with 0 fantasy points. Against New Orleans, had 0 receptions. It's embarrassing overall. But again, it's embarrassing because they play in the NFC South. Those matchups should be, a gold mine. And at the same time, Jameis just wasn't able to get it done. Regardless, this is a deep ball specialist, the guy that Tom Brady's going to be able to feed. Sure, he's never had over 100 receptions in a season, but that's not what we expect from deep ball specialists. We expect double-digit touchdowns and over 1,000 receiving yards, and I think that's where Mike Evans is going to get this season with a similar amount of catches to 75-ish this coming year, maybe more, hopefully more, maybe like 90. That'd be great. Overall, in terms of yards per route run, 7th last season, only had 74 catchable passes. Dropped a couple of them, but overall, did his due. I think Mike Evans is an extremely slept upon wide receiver. Sure, he's going to potentially be the number 2 in terms of opportunity on this team, but with this entire offensive scheme, with the tight ends that they have, the talent that they have, they're going to be put in a lot of advantageous scenarios, which is going to lead to a lot of fantasy points for a guy like Mike Evans. Tom Brady really hasn't had a receiver like Mike Evans on his roster in a while. I mean, they brought in Josh Gordon, a big-bodied speedster wide receiver. Sure, but, and he still was able to produce, but we really haven't seen the level of Mike Evans since, like, Randy Moss. And I know Randy Moss, is a legend, and Mike Evans is nowhere close to that, but that's the comparison that we can make in terms of a receiver that's really going to go downfield and make a huge difference in this offense. So either way, he's my number 9. Moving on. Number 10, Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is a very interesting story. He played 16 games last season, but the Jets game, he played like 11% of the snaps because he got injured and practically put up no fantasy points at all. I think he put up 1.2 in that game. But overall, so when we talk about his entire season, we can make it on a 15-game basis, but again, we'll just do it on a 16-game basis just for, the balance sake. 119 targets, 79 receptions, 1,189 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, 207 fantasy points, and 12.94 fantasy point per game average. Overall, this offense is leaning more towards the passing game. I mean, they're leaning towards 600 passing attempts a season and letting Dak really air it out. And that's what they're really successful at, to be honest. I mean, that's where their offense really took the next step. The running game is always going to be there with Zeke in this, bolstered up offensive line. But the passing game has gotten better. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Amari Cooper joined the team last season midway through and took this team to the next level in terms of deep ball pass, attempts, and then being able to just dominate in one-on-one coverage and really impose his will on defense. I mean, last season, he had 15 receptions of 20-plus yards, which led to 500 of his receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. I mean, a lot of his work came from deep ball passes, and that's a good thing because Dak Prescott had the 3rd highest deep pass completion percentage amongst all starting quarterbacks going into 2020. I mean, all in all, Dak Prescott is a good deep ball passer. With Amari Cooper, pretty much that's his bread and butter. Looks good to me. Now, the issue that kind of bothers me, and the reason why I have Amari Cooper at number 10, is that he had 6 performances of less than 7.5 fantasy points last season. Now, I know one of those games he left due to injury against the Jets, so we could say maybe 5 performances of less than 7.5 fantasy points. But a lot of those games had to do with the coverage that he was facing. I mean, overall, those games, and I looked at them and I tried to find a through line. Was it target count? No. Philadelphia had himself 12 targets, only 4 receptions, didn't deliver, right? Only one of the few games that he had at 10 plus targets didn't deliver on it. And I thought to myself, okay, what about these other games? Where did it all go wrong? Well, it had to do with the fact that one-on-one coverage was just too tight on Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper faced the Detroit Lions, Darius Slay, which he struggled heavily against, didn't produce in that game. Then played against New England in Foxborough, took on Stephon Gilmore and struggled heavily. Pretty much was a non-factor that game. And then played against the Rams and Jalen Ramsey and did nothing. When you play against top-tier cornerbacks like Darius Slay, like Stephon Gilmore, like Jalen Ramsey, Amari Cooper is going to disappear. And it scares me now because he has to play against Darius Slay twice a year as he is the newest member of the Philadelphia Eagles. And sure, the New York Giants don't really have too much of a secondary, and the Washington Redskins don't really have much of a defense. Sure, they're going to try to improve with Riverboat Ron as the head coach and try to, figure that out. Maybe get a new name, maybe the DC, Warriors. I don't know what they're going to do over there. But regardless, when Amari Cooper has tough coverage, it looks rough. Now, I looked at his 2020, total overall schedule. Week 1, you got Jalen Ramsey. That's the true test. Are you going to be able to redeem yourself from the last time you played the Rams? We'll see that. We're going to see it. I mean, obviously, the volatility is there for every wide receiver. We talked about it with Tyreek Hill. We're going to talk about it with Amari Cooper. He's going to have the big game performances. I mean, last season had 3 games of 20-plus fantasy points. The year prior had 3 games of 20-plus fantasy points. It all levels out in the end. But we want to go ahead and we want to be more consistent as a wide receiver. Hopefully, we can find that. I mean, again, he's been pretty good against the NFC East. 12.88 fantasy points per game against them. But when Darius Slay coming into the division, it scares me. That's why he sits at number 10. Moving on. Let's go ahead and talk about my number 11 wide receiver, Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen is a guy that is sliding on draft boards basically because he was injured last year. And a lot of people forget how good he was. I mean, sure, 48 targets, 30 receptions, 418 receiving yards for 6 touchdowns, 99 points, and a 9.94 fantasy point per game average last season. It doesn't excite anybody, but we really have to kind of think about what he was capable of. I mean, last season, weeks 1 through 7, prior to his injury, and then he came back later in the year at a very minimal level, wasn't even targeted that often. Prior to his injury, he was averaging 13.53 fantasy points per game in a run-heavy offense. So, I mean, where's the discrepancy here? Why are we always thinking that, Adam Thielen's a bum? He's not. He's in an offense that wants to run the ball a lot, but that only opens up play action. I mean, let's not forget 2018 was a year that the Minnesota Vikings produced 2 1,000-yard receivers and 2 guys that were in the top 12 receivers in fantasy. Adam Thielen was a top 12 wide receiver in 2017. It was only due to the injury that he sustained last year that really hurt him. I mean, when we go back and we look at 2018 statistics and what he was capable of, this is a guy that had 20 targets in the red zone, that led to 6 receptions, and had 8 consecutive games to start the 2018 season of 100-plus receiving yards, broke Calvin Johnson's record. I mean, Adam Thielen is no joke with Kirk Cousins, and I think a lot of people are forgetting just how good he was. Sure, Stephon Diggs is gone, and the complement on the opposite side of the field that opened up a lot of Adam Thielen's potential is gone. But to be honest, I don't really see that as a bad thing, because even without Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs was able to produce last year and be a manageably decent wide receiver in an offense that really didn't want to throw the ball very often. Again, Kirk Cousins had 162 less passing attempts last season than the year prior. But I think with Adam Thielen being far and away the number 1 passing threat in this offense, he's going to return to form, and I expect him to be a fantastic top 12 wide receiver this year. Again, this is a team that wants to dominate on the ground, but if and when the play action starts to kick in and you're running 2 tight end sets, and a lot of defenses are going to have to respect that with Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph and the upfront, rushing attack here, it's going to open up more opportunity for Adam Thielen, in my opinion. I think he can be moved around the field, whether it's slot, outside. They drafted a wide receiver in the 2nd round. They're going to have help to complement him. But overall, I expect him to be a fantastic wide receiver. If healthy, return to natural form. Moving on. Juju Smith-Schuster is my last quarterback. My last wide receiver I wanted to talk about today overall. Juju Smith-Schuster got the short end of the stick last year. Besides the fact that he was coming off of a top 12 fantasy football season in 2018. I think, if I'm not mistaken, finishes the number 7 or 8 wide receiver with over 1,000 yards and a monster season overall. It's unfortunate to see that there's a potential that, Juju Smith is not considered a top 12 guy, because in 2018, 166 targets, 111 receptions, 1,426 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns. Again, 241 fantasy points. Gosh, I couldn't get that out, with 15.1 fantasy points per game. 2018 was a ridiculously successful year for him. And sure, Ben Roethlisberger going down early and then him dealing with injuries wasn't helpful. And then the quarterback play was just a blunder. Mason Rudolph, Doug Hodges, Those are not complementary quarterbacks that are going to help you in fantasy. Yeah, I mean, sure, we saw Deontay Johnson and we saw James Washington produce, but Juju Smith-Schuster, he needs Ben Roethlisberger, and that's what he's going to get. I mean, Ben Roethlisberger, the last time we saw him healthy and going, 2018, had set career and franchise records in passing attempts with 675, had 34 touchdowns, finished as the number 3 quarterback in 4-point per passing touchdown formats in 2018. I mean, this is an offense that is going to be successful because of the return of Ben Roethlisberger, and I think in turn will help Juju Smith-Schuster get back to the promised land. So overall, I think to myself, okay, there's a potential. What is that sound? I think it's an airplane. I'm like, oh my God, is this an earthquake? Overall, I'm thinking to myself, Juju Smith-Schuster gets Big Ben back. Sure, doesn't have Antonio Brown flanking the other side of the field, but you have DeAndre Johnson now. You have the experience there. You bring in Eric Ebron. You have James Washington. There's talent on this team. It's going to open up more opportunities for Juju Smith. Again, his 2018 season, 26 red zone targets. He had 10 games of 10 targets in 2018. His opportunity was there, and that led to success. Last season, he didn't even have a single game of 10 plus targets. I'm telling you guys, do not sleep on Juju. He might not be a top 12 guy, but in at least maybe a top 16 is a guarantee because of his offensive association with Big Ben. I mean, think about the number 1 wide receivers with Big Ben. Antonio Brown was able to do that in 2014 and 2015, 300 plus fantasy points by himself without really a number 2 flanking him on the other side of the field, pulling away attention. To be honest, I mean, sure, there was a couple seasons with Emmanuel Sanders there, but overall, I potentially see this offense taking another step in the right direction, getting back to form, and just helping Juju Smith-Schuster reclaim his top 12 dominance. That's what I expect to see. Overall, thank you everybody for watching. Again, don't forget to click the like button if you like today's video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fantasy football content. Until next time, we'll be doing a mock draft, so look out for that soon. We'll be doing our first live mock draft of the 2020 fantasy football season. Be talking about my thought process, my approach, and all that jazz going into 2020. Really excited about putting out more content at a more frequent level. Now that I've established my top 12 at every core position in fantasy, we can really get into the nitty gritty, talk about sleepers, talk about drafting and draft strategies, and really take off and get into the 2020 season as most prepared we can possibly be. So more information on all of that coming soon. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. Thank you everybody, and I'll see you guys. Peace.